Hello and welcome to our webinar today. Today's topic is LGBTQ youth and supporting them in their needs. Our presenter today is Don Mikus. If there are other topics you would like to see us cover in one of our webinars, please contact me at the email address shown, dale.gasparovic@prevention.org. Also, you can follow us on Twitter at SACenterPF, or you can email me again at that email address to join our Student Assistance Center group site. Without further ado, I want to welcome Don Mikus as our presenter today to talk about LGBTQ youth. Don, I'm passing it over to you now.
All right. Thank you, Dale. As Dale mentioned, my name is Don Mitkus. I'm a consultant with Prevention First Student Assistance Center, and we are here to talk about working with LGBTQ students. There's, boy, what a large amount of press that has been in discussion around this particular group. Not to date this particular webinar, but I will to fail to recognize that we had a mass shooting down in Orlando at a gay club that resulted in 50 people being killed and many more injured. The amount of sensitivity that, as a culture, we've made great strides in so many ways. But we still have quite a ways to go in integrating and being sensitive to the needs of this particular group. And for those not familiar, LGBTQ does stand for lesbian, gay, bi, trans, and queer. So these are students that are identifying as having a different gender or sexual orientation, which, as you know, all adolescents, pre-adolescents, adolescents are struggle with sexual identity, just in general. Even if you're in the quote-unquote mainstream and heterosexual and going through a normal developmental process, sexual identity is a milestone developmental task for our youth. So for those that are dealing with identification as something other than mainstream, this is the difficulties are multiplied. What we're going to start out with is let's define some terms. So sex refers to the physical aspects of our body: chromosomes, genitals, hormones, facial hair. Within our culture, the dominant cultural perception, reinforced and entrenched by medical and legal system, is that one's sex determines one's gender. So there's a difference between sex and gender. Gender is how we perceive ourselves, our gender identity, and how we want to demonstrate that to others, to society, our gender expression. The most common gender identities, of course, are man or woman. But there are variations included in the umbrella terms trans or transgender. So the difference is sex is what we are, what our genetics dictate. Gender is how we perceive ourselves, and that can be different than what our genetic makeup is. So gender identity is how one perceives oneself as a man, as a woman, or otherwise. Gender expression is how we demonstrate our gender to others through our clothing, through our social roles and language, and is typically described in a polarity of masculine or feminine. And then there are gender norms. These are the norms that are dictated by the culture in which we live in. They're inherently tied to other cultural norms relating to ethnicity, class, physical ability, age, and how you are perceived by others, either masculine or feminine, depends on how you choose to express your gender, and physical characteristics fit with the perceptions of other attributes you have. Sexual orientation. Now, again, we have gender expression, gender identity. Now there's sexual orientation. There are many layers to being sensitive to LGBTQ students. Our sexual orientations are who we are attracted to. The terms gay, lesbian, hetero, bi, poly are intended to describe attractions to a particular sex or gender, while queer or pansexual is used by some people to indicate attraction outside the binary norms of sex and gender. FTM is an abbreviation for female to male, transsexual. This person, and this is part of where our sensitivity toward this culture needs to be attended to, this person most likely prefers masculine pronouns, being referred to as him or he, as opposed to she or her. Conversely, for male to female transsexual MTF, the person more likely prefers feminine pronouns. So we have to be conscious of our language and how we address people. So if you have a student that is identified as transsexual and identifies as a female, we need to be sensitive to use female pronouns, even if we have known this person when they were presenting themselves as male. Transphobia, the aversion or prejudice against transsexuality or transgender people, such as the refusal to accept the individual's expression of their gender identity. This transphobia can be direct or indirect. It's often seen when people are forced to express their gender according to someone else's perception or assumption of their gender. This has come up most prominently in the bathroom debate. And what bathroom can someone use? And it's very divisive in our culture, in American culture currently, and it's received a lot of attention recently, and is the focus of lawsuits in districts across the U.S. So there's a lot of debate on both sides. Those that are seeking to for that person to self-identify as male or female, to be able to use that gender's bathroom, and there are those that are against. Transgender it's an umbrella term for those individuals whose gender identity does not match what their physical sex is. So this includes, amongst others, transsexuals, genderqueer people, and cross-dressers. In its general sense, it refers to anyone whose behavior or identity falls outside of stereotypical expectations for their gender. Transgender people can identify as straight, gay, bisexual, or some other sexual orientation. Sometimes this word is just shortened as trans. So it's, we're, again, talking about there's gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. They may not be, you may have someone who is male to female, transsexual, that their sexual orientation could be they are attracted to males, or it could be they are attracted to females. It's not as neat or cut and dry as how they choose to express their gender. So the best way to ensure that you're using the proper terminology or pronouns, or how you address them when referring to an individual, is to find out the terminology they themselves prefer. Point is, ask them. These folks are far too often the victims of assumption. So don't assume someone wants to be addressed in a particular way. Ask them what they prefer, and it's out of respect. We need to honor that. In particular, this group, there's sexual minority stress and stigma. Meyer, back in 2003, developed what he called the minority stress model. So it's composed of 5 factors, which is the stress that goes along with being a sexual and stigma that goes along with being a sexual minority is they anticipate being rejected by the cultural norm or by the majority. They expect to be discriminated against, or they experience discrimination. There's an internalized homophobia because they grow up in a culture where there are certain norms when it comes to gender and sexuality that they can develop a sense of self-loathing, concealment of one's identity, so complying or conforming to societal norms around gender or sexuality in an attempt to fit in and not be a target of discrimination can cause quite a bit of distress, and developing the coping strategies for that. So how do they compensate for that in a way that they can still express their gender identity and sexuality without becoming a target? So the stressors are unique, they're chronic. This is just because someone becomes an adult doesn't mean that they stop being discriminated against, doesn't mean that they don't still suffer from an internalized homophobia. And these stressors are socially based. These are stressors that are induced by comparison to the social or societal norm, and being scrutinized for discrimination or discriminatory behavior because of their gender identity or their sexual orientation. So heteronormativity. So the processes through which social institutions, policies reinforce our society and our laws and our culture reinforce the notion that there are only 2 possibilities for sex, gender, and sexual attraction, which is male attracted to female and female attracted to male. It's everything that from his and hers bath towels to the institution of marriage. It reinforces that this is the norm, that heterosexual relationships are the norm, and if you're outside the norm, there is something quote unquote wrong with you. And heterosexism is a system of repression that benefits straight or heterosexual people at the expense of LGBT people. It can take the form of homophobia or biphobia, biases and discrimination towards lesbian, gay, bisexual, or LGB. We'll refer to it as LGB. That there's partner benefits. If you're married, if you're in a heterosexual relationship, you can get married in any state of the union. If you are in a same gender relationship, then you are not able to be married in every state in the union. Nor are you necessarily, if you could have been someone's partner for 50 years, but have no legal right to benefits or survivor benefits or death benefits if that partner passes away. So there's this, from a cultural and systemic standpoint, it creates additional stress on those that are not part of the heteronorm. So we, in a heteronormative society, there's a privilege there. We don't come out if you're heterosexual. There's no coming out. There's no need to announce that you're heterosexual in our culture. You just are. There's a institutionalized acceptance that the norm is the norm is there's a heteronormativity, as opposed to LGBT culture where there's a process of coming out and a need to announce that in order to be recognized as such. Amongst LGBT, internalized sexual stigma, also called, we referred to it previously as internalized homophobia, it refers to the personal acceptance and endorsement of sexual stigma as part of the individual's value system and self-concept. Its counterpart to sexual prejudice amongst heterosexuals. So there's again, there's that element of self-loathing that can come along with being LGBT, because not being part of the norm means that for some there's this feeling that there is something wrong with them because they are this is their gender identity and their sexual orientation. Something to know, and certainly some remarkable statistics about the LGBT community, and youth in particular. Youth in general, suicide is the second leading cause of death of people ages 10 to 24. LGBT youth are 4 times more likely. And questioning meaning that they're not quite, they're not at a point where they've made a determination or have come to a level of acceptance about their gender identity or sexual orientation. 3 times more likely to attempt suicide as their heterosexual peers. And the suicide attempts made by LGBT youth, questioning youth, are 4 to 6 times more likely to result in injury, poisoning, or overdose that requires medical attention compared to their straight peers. So not only are they more likely to attempt suicide, the suicide attempts are potentially more lethal. Nearly half of our transgender people have seriously thought about taking their lives, and 1/4 may report having a suicide attempt. So transgender youth are at very, very high risk. And when we talking with these students, we have to be aware that they're that much more vulnerable to depression and anxiety and suicide thoughts and suicide attempts. So when we're talking with them, this is something that we need to explore with them and kind of determine where they're at with it. To do so, to not do so would be negligent. And as you know, that not everybody who comes out has a supportive family, or an understanding family, or families that accept that this is who they are. So LGBT youth that come from a highly rejecting family are 8.5 times as likely to have attempted suicide than their peers, LGBT peers, who reported no or low levels of family rejection. So if you have a student that identifies as LGBT and is being rejected by one or both parents or other family members, these folks are at extremely high risk for suicidal thoughts, ideations, and attempts. So 1 out of 6 students nationwide, grades 9 through 12, seriously considered suicide in the past year. So suicidality in general is, amongst our high school kids, is a serious issue. But when you add the stress of being an LGBT or questioning youth or a trans youth, that risk skyrockets. And it's incumbent on us to take their temperature as far as how they're feeling in regards to their mood and their thoughts, and if they're having thoughts that could be potentially dangerous.
And Don, it seems to me that a lot of what you just said could be correlated back probably to some of that internalized homophobia that these young people feel, that results in depressive type symptoms and those thoughts of suicidality.
Well, certainly there's both the internal in the self shame, the that's compounded by the rejection by family, by rejection by peers. Not to mention that we haven't even talked about the bullying or victimization that occurs of these students by their peers. Um, that rejection by people who were previously parts of their support system. These kids have some really incredibly high risk factors, and internally their resources could be potentially very tapped because they're experiencing this cognitive dissonance that this is how I feel who I am, but it's not with what I'm expected to be or what I should be. And unfortunately, these kids should stop. They really need to stop shitting all over themselves, because it's not. It's there. These issues compound and create a very volatile situation, and compound that with the lack of the even higher level of cultural unacceptance amongst Black and Hispanics. It makes it's doubled. Their suicide attempts are doubled amongst Black and Hispanic youth that are LGB. So there's these are all things that we need to really be mindful of as we're interacting with these students. In each episode of victimization, verbal or physical harassment or abuse increases the chances even farther. So of self-harming or suicide attempts by 2.5 times. So each time, so if you have a kid, again, if you have a kid that's presenting to you that has been rejected by their family, that is being rejected and abused by their peers, these kids are at very, very, very high risk, and we need to be sensitive to that. We need to make sure that they're safe and that they have resources, and that we're offering them support or a place that they can seek support from. They need to provide a safe place. Just to touch on this, there's our LGBTQ youth are more likely to engage in self-injuring behaviors. In particular, bisexual women and lesbians report the highest prevalence of self-injuring behaviors, and bisexual is found to have elevated odds of self-injury and suicidal ideation. So the higher the level of socially based stressors, the more likely they are to engage in dysfunctional coping skills such as self-injury. So in this particular population is particularly prone to experience socially based stressors than their heterosexual peers. I didn't do this transition. Okay. All right. So discrimination and interpersonal trauma, violence, discrimination, victimizations are predictors of suicidal and non-suicidal self-injury in LGBT groups. So women and transgender groups were more likely to report a history of suicide attempts and self-injury than the males. 96% reported experiencing sexual minority discrimination at least once. So it's discrimination based on the fact that they're a sexual minority is a certainty for these folks. They will experience it. Very few, very, very few do not. So it's a safe assumption to make that when you're dealing with a student that is identifying as a sexual minority, they have been subjected to discrimination on at least one occasion. And 75%, 3 out of 4, have had at least one incident of violence, discrimination, or victimization based on the fact that they're a sexual minority. So these folks are not only experience discrimination, but are being traumatized by others based on the fact that they're a sexual minority. In both the interpersonal trauma and discrimination, we're found to significantly increase the odds of having had a suicide attempt or engaging in non-suicidal self-injury. So again, this study by House, Van Horn, Coppins, and Stiefelman really drive home the fact that this is a highly vulnerable population. Pardon me. So some things to consider is there's a need to normalize gender exploration and gender variance. We need to encourage exploration of options. We need to be aware of the elevated risk of concurrent disorders such as depression, anxiety, self-injurious behavior, eating disorders. Identify community resources. If you're fortunate enough to live in the Chicago metro area or the Collier counties, there are resources available, fairly readily available, both in the school and outside the school for supporting LGBTQ students. But you have to identify and build bridges with those resources. So identifying a resource is not the same as knowing what you're referring to. So I would encourage you that if you're able to identify those resources in the community, those support resources, that you also reach out and have a discussion with them about what's the best route to get a student connected to them and whether or not they're credible, whether or not they do what they say they do.
Don, I'd like to, at this point, since you're mentioning community resources, just kind of give a recommendation. There is an organization called the Safe School Alliance that serves schools across the state of Illinois. I know they have a grant from the Illinois Department of Human Services to provide assistance on some of these LGBTQ issues for schools and in dealing with those kinds of things. So if you Google Safe School Alliance, you'll find them. And I've seen some of their resources, which are really good.
Excellent. And there's, depending on what area you're in, there's the Questioning Youth Center, there's PFLAG, the Gay Straight Alliance. I mean, there's a number of national or organizations or regional organizations, Howard Brown Center downtown, that you can tap into for both resources to refer to as well as to obtain resources for your students. But again, you have to do the work beforehand. You don't want to be in a situation where you're all of a sudden need to refer a kid for support and you don't know where to start other than to hit Google. You want to identify those resources beforehand and establish some linkage with them before the need presents itself. Make your environment LGBTQ friendly. Again, it's a matter of being sensitive and asking and inquiring how they prefer to be referred to, what pronouns to use. It's there's no dumb questions here. This is new territory for a lot of people, and most kids that I've dealt with that are LGBTQ are not afraid to express, because they've had to learn if they're going to be had to learn how to self-advocate pretty early on, if they're going to be respected and get their needs met. So ask the questions. Don't be afraid. They will let you know whether or not you're saying the right thing or how to address them. Again, advocate with other service providers. Create safety plans. These are kids that are at high risk for victimization or discrimination. So if they're not, and often feel unsafe. So creating with them a safety plan of who they can go to, who they can talk to, who they can call in the event that they're not feeling safe either internally or externally. And help coordinate care for a person undergoing gender transition. Gender transition is a significant event. It rarely happens for those for minors, but there are occasional minors that are going through a gender transition. Could be hormone therapy, could be not full-on gender reassignment. Typically doesn't happen until they're adults, but that's how making sure that that there are resources and support available for those folks going through a pretty difficult time. Hormone therapy is no picnic. So just be aware that they might have particular needs if they're undergoing or starting that process. So some action tips for working with these folks. Don't assume you can tell if someone's transgender. Transgender and transsexual people don't all look a certain way or come from a certain same background, or many may not appear visibly trans, quote unquote. And indeed, many trans people live most of their lives with very few people knowing their trans status. Don't make assumptions about a trans person's sexual orientation. Again, and we touched on this before, gender identity is different than sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is about who we're attracted to. Gender identity is about how we know our own gender. Trans people can identify as gay or straight or bisexual or asexual for that matter. Please, take nothing else out of this. Be careful about confidentiality. Be careful about disclosure. Be careful in outing someone. Some trans people feel comfortable disclosing their trans status to others, and some do not. Knowing a trans person's status is personal information, and it is up to them to share it with others. Do not casually share this information or gossip about a person you know or think is trans. Not only is it's an invasion of privacy, it can have some serious negative consequences in a world that is very intolerant of gender differences. Trans people can lose jobs, housing, friends, and again, we talk about a very sensitive a very vulnerable population to depression and suicidal thoughts and ideations. This sort of outing can lead to some pretty desperate behaviors or choices. Understand the difference between coming out as LGB and coming out as trans. Unlike coming out in a LBG context, where the act of disclosing one's sexuality reveals the truth about that person's sexual orientation, disclosing one's trans status often has the opposite effect. What I mean is when a person comes out as trans, the listener often assumes the truth, quote unquote, about the trans person is that they are somehow more fundamentally a member of their birth sex rather than the gender sex that they've chosen to live in. Sometimes coming out makes it more difficult for a trans person to be fully recognized as the sex gender they are living in. Don't tolerate anti-trans remarks or humor in public places. Don't tolerate anti-LGBTQ remarks. Don't blow it off. Consider some strategies to confront anti-LGBT remarks or jokes in the classroom or in the hallways or in the locker rooms. Don't tolerate the flippant use of kids saying, "Oh, you're gay," or those sorts of put downs that are indirectly very hurtful to those that are. Don't tolerate those things. Confront them. Let people know that it's not okay. And again, if you don't know what pronouns to use, ask, be polite and respectful, and they'll let you know. Be patient with a person who's questioning their gender identity. They might shift back and forth as they find out what identity or gender presentation is best for them. It's not an event, it's a process. They might, for example, choose a new name or pronoun and then decide at a later time to change the name or pronoun back. Do your best to be respectful and use the name and or pronoun requested. Again, we go back to the whole idea of internalized homophobia. There's a level of cognitive dissonance that goes along with being a sexual minority, that their process of discovering and solidifying who they are as individuals can be a real roller coaster, just like with any adolescent. But this is the ride on this roller coaster is more harrowing than for those in in our heteronormative normal culture. Don't try to tell a person what category or what identity they fit into. Don't apply labels or identities to a person they have not chosen for themselves. If someone is not sure of which identity or path fits them best, give them the time to figure it out for themselves. They'll let you know, but don't try to help them categorize or identify where they fit. That's their journey to take, and for them to let you know. Don't assume what a path a trans person is on regarding surgery or hormones, and don't quote unquote privilege one path over another. You can affirm the ways all of us can transcend gender boundaries, including the choices some of us make to use medical technology to change our bodies. Pardon me. Some trans people want to be recognized as their gender of choice without surgery or hormones. So don't, the point is don't judge if whichever path they choose to take. Some people don't want to go through the pain or the radical transformation that surgery would take them through. Don't ask a trans person what their quote real name is. For some trans people, being associated with their birth name is a tremendous source of anxiety, or it's a part of their life they simply want to leave behind. Respect the name a trans person is currently using.
John, this is something that I think a lot of transgender folks deal with, especially in schools, because school records may indicate their quote real name.
Right.
And so some teachers, due to either lack of knowledge or lack of sensitivity, continue to use that quote real name as their calling role.
Right. And that's part of our, as a culture, our institutionalized homophobia. That this is the name, this is their legal name, and for some, yes, it might be their legal name, but it's not how they wish to be addressed or how they wish to identify themselves until they can remediate that. And it can, using their birth name can be a reminder of a very difficult or stressful time that they had when they were unable to express who they feel they really are. All right. I know this sounds obvious, but don't ask a trans person about a trans person's genitals or surgical status. If you think about it, it wouldn't be considered appropriate to ask a non-trans person about the appearance or status of their genitalia, so it's not appropriate to ask a trans person that question either. And likewise, don't ask them if they've had the surgery. If they want to talk to you about it, they can bring it up, but it's not polite, and it can be extremely anxiety provoking to enter into that line of questioning with someone who's trans. And again, this seems obvious, but don't ask a trans person how they have sex. It wouldn't be considered appropriate to ask a non-trans person about how they have sex. So that same courtesy should be extended to trans people. Here we go. Don't police public bathrooms. We can encourage, and there's been a lot of media coverage about this recently, and a lot of debate around bathrooms and what bathroom someone can use. Certainly you can encourage schools or businesses or agencies to have a unisex bathroom option, which seems to be the most expedient way to address the issue. Or you can have someone offer to accompany a trans person to the bathroom in a buddy system, so they're less vulnerable. All right, don't just add the T without doing the work. LGBT it's a commonplace acronym that joins lesbian and bisexual and gay and transgender under the same umbrella. To be an ally to trans people, gays and lesbians and bisexuals need to examine their own gender stereotypes, their own prejudices and fears about trans people, and be willing to defend and be accepting of trans lives. So there's, even within the LGBT community, there's prejudice and stigma. There's difference between being LBG and being trans, and there's discrimination even amongst that community, the sexual minority community. Don't be afraid to know your own limits as an ally to LGBTQ students. Don't be afraid to admit you don't know everything. When dealing with an LGBTQ person who may have sought you out for support or guidance, because that's the roles that we play in schools as counselors, social workers, SAPs, school psychs. We're there to provide support to students. Know when you've reached the limits of your own helpfulness and skill set. If you don't feel equipped to help someone address a particular issue, know that it's time to admit that you're not equipped to handle it and refer them somewhere. It's better to admit that you don't know something than to provide information that might be incorrect or hurtful. These are folks that are subject to discrimination and inaccurate information all the time. Don't contribute to the problem. If you don't know something or need to refer, please do so. The best way to be an ally is to listen with an open mind to the trans people and the LGBTQ themselves. They're the experts of their own lives. Be non-judge, as we are trained as counselors and social workers. We are trained to listen non-judgmentally, and we need to listen with those sorts of ears when dealing with these students. We need to be aware of our own biases. We all have them. We all have biases. It's how we're built. And we need to question ourselves as far as what are our own biases in regards to gender identity, in regards to sexual orientation, in regards to the transgender community. And take a real good hard look at it before we're confronted with one of these students in a role where we need to provide support. Because if we are not open and honest with ourselves about our own biases, we will not be in a position to be able to help these students. And as we've mentioned, these students are extraordinarily vulnerable to depression and suicidality. So we need to be equipped and ready to help them should they present, they darken our doorstep, and they will. We need to be ready to be in a position to help them because they are at some tremendous risk. Here's some resources. Lend a Legal, the Trevor Project, PFLAG Chicago. These are all relatively local resources that you can find additional information and support. And again, other organizations and community supports are crucial. Identifying some counselors and therapists in the community that are LGBTQ friendly, and not only friendly, but have an understanding of how to work with population. Not all of them do. So it's having that, if you want to have that complete resource list, those are some folks that you need to have on there. And that is about it. Thank you for your time. We've been speaking about working with LGBTQ students. If you have questions or concerns or need some additional resources, my email address is listed here. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dale.
All right, thank you, Don, and I appreciate the information. I hope this has been a helpful resource to those of you working in the student assistance field. If you have questions, you can contact Don, or you can contact me at my email address that is on the screen now. Also, if there are other topics that you'd like to see covered in one of our webinars, please shoot me an email and let me know. Follow us on Twitter at SA Center PF, or join our group site by contacting me via email. Thank you once again, Don, and everybody have a great day.